She never imagined that the happiest day of her life would turn into the darkest, binding her to a man she never loved. The day had begun like a dream. The girl was supposed to marry the man she thought was her soulmate, her heart's only choice. She had envisioned her future with him walking hand in hand, building a life filled with laughter and sharing the kind of love that made people believe in destiny. But fate was cruel that morning. Just hours before the wedding, everything shattered. Her groom vanished, leaving nothing but whispers and disgrace in his absence. Her world crumbled as her family panicked. In their eyes, her honor, their reputation, and the fragile pride of tradition were all at stake. The hall was filled with guests, the priest waiting, and the bride dressed in her gown. A wedding without a groom was a humiliation they could never allow. And so, in the chaos, a decision was made, one that would change her life forever. Her groom's best friend was chosen to take his place, a man she barely knew. Someone who had always stood in the background of her life, quiet, watchful, and mysterious. He was everything her groom wasn't: calm, unreadable, and sharp like a blade hidden beneath silk. Without her consent, the vows were spoken, the rituals completed, and the marriage sealed. As she sat in silence, tears staining her makeup, the crowd clapped, oblivious to the storm in her heart. She had been forced into a bond she never wanted, her future rewritten in the span of a few merciless minutes. But in that moment of despair, she didn't realize that this unwanted union would ignite a love story far more powerful than anything she had ever dreamed of, one born out of fire, betrayal, and the strangest twist of destiny. She believed silence would keep her safe, but silence only made her hear the sound of her own breaking heart. The wedding night was suffocating. She sat on the edge of the decorated bed, the heavy jewelry weighing on her like chains, her eyes fixed on the flickering candlelight. The man who was now her husband entered quietly, his footsteps steady, his face calm but unreadable. She didn't raise her eyes. Her chest tightened with resentment, confusion, and fear. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then, in a low voice, he said, "I didn't ask for this." The words startled her. She glanced at him and saw something unexpected in his eyes. Not arrogance, not victory, but a weary resignation. They were both prisoners of a fate neither had chosen. He kept his distance, taking a seat across the room. His composure unnerved her. If she had expected harshness, anger, or even indifference, instead, he gave her space, as if he understood her pain. Still, his silence was heavy, filled with things unspoken. Days passed, and the house became a battlefield of quiet glances and restrained conversations. To the world, they were husband and wife, but behind closed doors, they were strangers bound by an invisible wall. Yet cracks began to appear in that wall. She noticed how he stepped in when her relatives whispered cruelly behind her back, shutting them down with just a few sharp words. She saw the way his gaze softened when she played with the children of the household, though he never admitted it, never touched her, never demanded her affection, but his presence lingered like a shadow, steady and undeniable. At night, when she lay awake, she wondered about him, the man who had given up his own freedom for hers. Was he cold, or was he protecting something buried deep inside? And why did her heart, despite all the pain, beat a little faster when he entered the room? One stormy evening, fate forced them closer than ever before. Lightning split the sky, the power went out, and in the darkness, she found herself standing inches from him. The silence was no longer safe, it was charged, fragile, and trembling with something neither of them could name. She told herself she hated him, but her heart betrayed her every time his eyes found hers. Life under the same roof became an endless test. Each morning she woke with a reminder that she belonged to a man who was never meant to be hers. She avoided him at the breakfast table, her words clipped, her tone guarded. Yet no matter how hard she tried, her eyes betrayed her. They searched for him in a crowded room, caught the curve of his lips when he almost smiled, and lingered on his silhouette when he left the house. He, too, kept his distance, never crossing boundaries, never demanding what tradition had supposedly granted him. But his actions spoke in whispers. When she fell ill with a fever, he stayed awake through the night, quietly placing a wet cloth on her forehead. When she nearly slipped in the courtyard, his hand shot out faster than instinct, gripping her tightly until she found her balance. He released her as quickly as he had caught her, but her skin burned where his fingers had been. Confusion gnawed at her. She was supposed to despise him for taking the place of the man she had chosen, for being the reason her dreams had crumbled. Yet with each passing day, the lines blurred. Hatred and gratitude warred in her heart, and in the shadows of that war, something fragile began to bloom. One evening, as she sat by the window, watching the rain fall, he approached quietly. For the first time, he spoke more than a few words. "You deserve better than this." "Better than me? Better than what they forced on you?" His voice was steady, but there was a trace of sorrow hidden deep within. She turned to him, startled by the honesty in his tone. He wasn't a villain stealing her freedom. He was a man bound by the same chains, carrying burdens she didn't yet understand. For a moment, the air between them softened, fragile and dangerous all at once. Her heart thudded painfully as she looked away, whispering to herself words she couldn't believe. What if fate hadn't been so cruel? The night she heard him playing the piano, she realized he was carrying a pain as deep as hers. It was late. The house quiet except for the steady ticking of the old clock. She wandered into the hall, drawn by a sound she hadn't expected, the soft, aching notes of a piano. Each chord was filled with sorrow, every melody whispering stories of love lost and dreams broken. She stood in the shadows, watching him play, unaware that her presence was known. His face, usually unreadable, was open in that moment, every note pulling at something hidden inside him. It was as if he wasn't playing music, but confessing secrets. And for the first time she wondered, what was he hiding behind his calm silence? When the final note faded, he looked up, and their eyes met. She froze, unsure if she should apologize for intruding, but he only gave her a faint smile, almost broken. "You're not the only one who lost something," he said quietly, his voice rough as though it had carried those words for years. Her breath caught. Until then, she had believed she was the only victim of their forced union. But as she looked at him in that dim light, she saw it clearly. He was just as trapped, just as hurt, just as unwilling as she was. That night, she couldn't sleep. The sound of the piano lingered in her chest. Along with a dangerous thought, she tried desperately to push away. What if this marriage was not the end of her story, but the beginning of another? She thought their marriage was a prison, but slowly it began to feel like a secret escape. The days passed in silence, yet that silence no longer felt hostile. Every morning she caught him watching her with an expression he quickly tried to hide. At first, she believed it was pity, but soon she realized it was something else's curiosity, maybe even care. He began noticing little things. When her tea went cold because she was too lost in thought, he quietly replaced it with a fresh cup. When she struggled with the heavy window shutters, he fixed them without being asked. These were small gestures, but in a world where everything else felt forced, they were enough to leave her breathless. One evening, rain hammered against the windows. She found herself sitting opposite him in the library, a book in her hand she hadn't read a word of. The storm outside seemed to blur the line between them, pulling them closer. He finally broke the silence. "Do you ever wonder," he asked softly, "if the things we hate the most are the very things meant to save us?" She looked up, startled by the raw honesty in his voice. His eyes, once so guarded, were searching hers like he was hoping for an answer he'd been waiting years to hear. For the first time, she didn't feel like she was married to a stranger. She felt like she was standing at the edge of something dangerous, fragile, and achingly beautiful. And it terrified her, because falling in love with him would mean betraying the ghost of the man she once loved. She promised herself she would never love him, but her heart was already breaking that vow. Every night, she lay awake listening to the faint sound of his footsteps echoing in the dark corridors. She tried to hate him, to remember that this marriage was forced, unnatural, unfair. But hate was slipping through her fingers like sand. One evening, she found herself outside the study, hearing his voice for the first time, not in conversation, but in confession. He spoke on the phone with a friend, and she overheard words that made her chest ache. "I never wanted this," he said, his tone heavy. "Not because of her, but because she deserves freedom, and I don't know how to give it." Her heart clenched. She realized he was suffering too, carrying the weight of a marriage neither of them had chosen, yet trying to shield her from more pain. That night at dinner, when their eyes met, she didn't look away. For the first time, she allowed the silence between them to soften, to breathe. Afterward, he walked her to her room, and just before leaving, he said quietly, "One day, when you're ready, I want you to know, I'll never be your prison." The words echoed in her mind long after he was gone. And though she wanted to deny it, her heart whispered the truth. She was already falling. Slowly, dangerously, for the man she once swore she could never love. She thought their secret feelings would stay hidden, but fate had other plans. The small changes in their relationship didn't go unnoticed. Servants whispered when they lingered too long in the same room. Friends raised eyebrows when their arguments softened into quiet conversations. And soon, the world outside began to sense what they themselves were too afraid to admit. One afternoon, at a gathering, someone asked how long they had been married. She opened her mouth to give a rehearsed answer, but before she could speak, he slipped his hand gently over hers. The gesture was casual to others, but to her, it sent a shock straight through her chest. "Not long," he said, his voice calm, "but long enough to know she's the bravest woman I've ever met." Her cheeks burned, her heart racing as she tried to mask the emotions flooding inside her. That night, when they were finally alone, she confronted him. "Why did you say that?" she asked, her voice trembling. He looked at her for a long moment, and then, instead of answering, he stepped closer. "Because it's true," he whispered. For the first time, she didn't back away. The distance between them shattered as if the walls they had built for so long finally crumbled. But just as her heart leaned into his, a shadow of doubt returned. She remembered the promise of her past, the man she had once believed was her forever. Loving her husband's best friend would mean rewriting her destiny, something she was in, too sure she was strong enough to do. She was torn between the love she lost and the love she never expected to find. The nights grew heavier. Her heart pulled in two directions. Memories of her late husband still haunted her, but the man standing before her now, the man she was forced to marry, was no longer just a stranger in her life. He had become her comfort, her anchor, the silent strength she hadn't realized she needed. One evening, the truth finally broke out. She found him in the garden, standing under the dim glow of lantern light, his hands clenched as though fighting himself. When he saw her, his guard fell away. "I can't keep pretending anymore," he said, his voice raw. "I know this marriage wasn't meant to happen, and I've tried to give you space, but every day, every moment, I find myself falling deeper. And if that means losing you forever, then at least you'll know the truth. I love you." Her chest ached as tears filled her eyes. She wanted to fight it, deny it, but the words slipped out before she could stop them. "So do I." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full, alive, trembling with the weight of unspoken promises. When he reached for her hand, she didn't pull away. She let him hold it. Let herself believe that maybe fate hadn't trapped her, it had saved her. The world would never understand. Some would call it betrayal, others would call it wrong. But as she looked into his eyes, she realized that love wasn't always about rules or expectations. Sometimes, it was about survival, about finding light in the darkest places. And in that moment, she knew she hadn't lost everything. She had found something new, something fierce, something hers. A love that was never planned, yet destined all along.